There is a stillness that comes just before violence, a held breath, a tensed muscle, the space between heartbeats where possibility hangs like dust in afternoon light. If you could step back through the corridors of time, past the marble ruins and weathered stones, past the careful reconstructions of what we think we know about ancient Greece, you would find yourself standing at the edge of a circle drawn in sand. The sun beats down mercilessly, and the air shimmers with heat and anticipation. Two men face each other, their bodies gleaming with olive oil and sweat, their eyes locked in that primal recognition that only one will walk away whole. This is pankration. The word itself rolls off the tongue like honey mixed with iron. Pan, meaning all, and kratos, meaning power. All power, total strength. The complete and utter mastery of one human being over another through nothing but flesh and bone and will. It was Greece's deadliest sport, and perhaps its most honest one. For in pankration, there were no weapons to hide behind, no armor to deflect the truth. There was only the naked vulnerability of the human form, stripped down to its most elemental purpose, survival. But to understand pankration, we must first understand the world that birthed it. Close your eyes and imagine ancient Greece not as the pristine white marble wonderland of museum displays, but as it truly was, a land painted in ochre and bronze, where the Mediterranean sun bleached everything to bone and shadow. The air was thick with the scent of wild thyme and olive groves, the sound of goat bells echoing off limestone cliffs, and always, always the endless whisper of the sea against stone shores. This was a world where gods walked among mortals, where heroes were measured not by their wealth or lineage, but by their ability to push the human body and spirit beyond all reasonable limits. The Greeks had a word for this, arete, excellence of character, the pursuit of one's highest potential. And nowhere was this pursuit more brutally evident than in the athletic competitions that dotted the landscape like sacred fires. The Olympic Games, established in 776 BCE, were more than mere sport. They were a religious festival, a temporary truce between warring city-states, a celebration of human achievement that transcended politics and petty grievances. For 5 days every 4 years, the world would hold its breath as athletes from across the Greek-speaking world gathered in Olympia to compete in events that tested every aspect of human capability. There was the stadion, the sprint that covered the length of the Olympic Stadium, roughly 200 meters of pure explosive speed. There was the diaulos, the double-length race that demanded both speed and endurance. The dolicho stretched the runners even further, a grueling test of stamina that could cover anywhere from 7 to 24 stadia. The pentathlon combined running, wrestling, long jump, discus, and javelin into a single competition that sought to identify the most complete athlete. But even among these tests of human excellence, pankration stood apart. It was different, darker, more primitive perhaps, or perhaps simply more honest about what competition truly meant when stripped of all pretense. Pankration emerged sometime in the 7th century BCE, though its exact origins are shrouded in the kind of mystery that seems to cling to all truly ancient things. Some say it was born from the fusion of boxing and wrestling, two sports that had already established themselves in the Olympic pantheon. Others trace its lineage back to the combat techniques developed by Greek soldiers and refined in the crucible of warfare. The truth, as is often the case with legends, likely lies somewhere in the fluid space between myth and history. What we do know is that by 648 BCE, pankration had earned its place at the Olympic Games, joining the sacred competitions that would define Greek athletic culture for over a millennium. But this was no gentle introduction. Pankration arrived like a storm, fierce and uncompromising, demanding a level of courage and skill that made even the bravest athletes think twice before entering its arena. The rules of Pankration were deceptively simple, and therein lay their terrifying beauty. Almost everything was permitted. Punches, kicks, throws, joint locks, chokes. The entire catalogue of human combat techniques was available to the competitors. Only 2 actions were forbidden: biting and gouging the eyes. Everything else was not just allowed, but expected. Imagine the psychological weight of stepping into such a competition. You would stand at the edge of that sand circle, your body oiled and naked according to Greek athletic tradition, facing an opponent who might outweigh you by 50 pounds or possess the flexibility of a dancer or the striking power of a blacksmith. You would know that in the next few minutes, you might experience pain beyond anything you had ever imagined. You might break bones or have your bones broken. You might be choked unconscious or twisted into submission. You might, if fortune truly abandoned you, die. And yet they came. Year after year, Olympiad after Olympiad, the finest athletes in the Greek world would present themselves for this ultimate test. Why? What drove them to willingly enter such a crucible of suffering? The answer lies in the Greek conception of heroism, which was fundamentally different from our modern understanding. To the ancient Greeks, a hero was not someone who avoided danger or minimized risk. A hero was someone who faced the possibility of death or defeat with such courage and skill that their actions transcended the merely human and touched the divine. In Pankration, every competitor had the opportunity to achieve this transcendence, to push beyond the limitations of ordinary existence and discover what lay on the other side of fear. The training required for Pankration was itself a form of spiritual discipline. Athletes would spend years developing not just their physical capabilities, but their mental fortitude. They would practice techniques until they became as natural as breathing, until their bodies could respond with perfect efficiency, even under the stress of combat. They would condition their skin and bones to withstand tremendous punishment, gradually building tolerance for pain that would seem impossible to the uninitiated. But perhaps most importantly, they would cultivate what the Greeks called ataraxia, a state of inner calm that could not be disturbed by external circumstances. A pankratiast, who allowed anger or fear to cloud his judgment, would quickly find himself at the mercy of a more disciplined opponent. The sport demanded not just physical supremacy, but complete mastery of the self. The gymnasium, where these warriors trained, was a sacred space in Greek society, as important to the community as the temple or the agora. Here, beneath the shade of plane trees or within the cool stone halls of covered porticos, young men would gather to push their bodies and minds to their absolute limits. The sound of flesh striking flesh would echo off the walls, punctuated by the grunts and gasps of men locked in mock combat, each trying to perfect techniques that might one day mean the difference between victory and humiliation. The training itself was methodical, almost ritualistic in its precision. A student might spend months learning a single throw, practicing the footwork and hip movement until the motion became as fluid and automatic as walking. He would drill joint locks until he could apply them blindfolded, until his fingers could find the precise pressure points that would force an opponent's submission. He would condition his shins by repeatedly kicking wooden posts, gradually building bone density and pain tolerance until he could deliver devastating kicks without flinching. And through it all, the master would watch, offering corrections with the careful attention of a sculptor shaping marble. "Feel the leverage," he might say, as a student struggled with a particularly complex takedown. The technique is not about strength. It is about understanding the laws that govern balance and momentum. Work with these laws, not against them. This philosophical approach to combat was uniquely Greek. Where other cultures might view fighting as simply a matter of brute force, the Greeks saw it as an art form, a physical expression of geometric principles and mechanical advantage. They studied the human body with the same intensity they brought to mathematics and astronomy, mapping its strengths and vulnerabilities with scientific precision. The greatest Pankration became legends not just for their victories, but for the beauty and intelligence of their technique. They were celebrated as artists as much as athletes, their most spectacular submissions remembered and recounted like epic poetry. A perfectly executed throw that left an opponent stunned and breathless might be discussed in gymnasiums across the Greek world for years, analyzed and admired like a masterpiece of sculpture or architecture. When the Olympic Games arrived, the atmosphere in Olympia would transform into something electric and sacred. Pilgrims and spectators would pour in from across the Greek world, from the sun-baked islands of the Aegean to the mountain villages of Epirus, from the wealthy merchant cities of Asia Minor to the austere military settlements of Sparta. They came not just to witness athletic competition, but to participate in a celebration of human potential that transcended the ordinary boundaries of daily life. The site of Olympia itself was designed to inspire awe. The sanctuary of Zeus dominated the sacred grove, its massive temple housing one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A 40-foot tall statue of the king of the gods, crafted by the master sculptor Phidias from gold and ivory. The statue's eyes were said to flash with divine fire, and many visitors reported feeling the god's presence as a physical weight in the air. But it was not just the religious significance that made Olympia special. The entire complex was a masterpiece of architectural harmony, designed according to principles of mathematical proportion that the Greeks believed reflected the underlying order of the universe. The stadium where the running events took place could hold over 40,000 spectators, its earthen embankments rising like natural hills around the flat racing surface. The hippodrome stretched for over 500 meters, its spina decorated with statues and altars to various gods and heroes. And tucked away in a corner of the sanctuary, smaller but no less significant, was the Scammer, the sandpit where Pankration and wrestling competitions took place. It was here, in this seemingly humble rectangle of carefully prepared earth, that some of the most brutal and beautiful displays of human capability would unfold. The sand itself was selected and prepared with ritualistic care. It had to be fine enough to provide cushioning for falls, but not so soft that it would shift and slide under the competitor's feet. It had to be deep enough to absorb blood and sweat, but not so deep that it would tire the athletes unnecessarily. The preparation of the Scammer was considered so important that it was overseen by the Hellenodices, the sacred judges who administered the games, personally. When the day of competition arrived, the atmosphere would be charged with an almost unbearable tension. The competitors would enter the Scammer like gladiators entering the arena, their bodies gleaming with oil, their muscles rippling under skin bronzed by years of training in the Mediterranean sun. The crowd would fall silent. 40,000 people holding their breath as one, waiting for the moment when human beings would transcend their limitations and touch something divine. The Hellenodice would raise his staff. a simple gesture that somehow contained within it the weight of centuries of tradition. The competitors would eye each other across the sand, measuring, calculating, preparing for war. And then, with a motion so subtle it seemed almost accidental, the judge would lower his staff, and the dance would begin. To watch Pankration was to witness something primal and beautiful and terrible all at once. These were not the choreographed exchanges of modern martial arts demonstrations, but raw, desperate struggles between men who had dedicated their lives to this singular moment. Every movement carried the potential for victory or catastrophe. A single mistake, a moment's loss of balance, a slight miscalculation of distance, could transform a dominant position into a submission hold, could turn triumph into agony in the space of a heartbeat. The techniques themselves were marvels of human ingenuity applied to the problem of subduing another human being. A Pancratius might begin with boxing techniques, using his fist to soften his opponent and create openings for more complex attacks. Lightning-fast jabs would probe for weaknesses, while powerful hooks and uppercuts would attempt to end the contest with a single decisive blow. But unlike pure boxing, a Pancratist had to remain constantly aware of his opponent's ability to grab, throw, and take him to the ground. This awareness created a unique fighting stance and movement pattern that set Pankration apart from its component arts. The Pancratius would keep his hands high enough to defend against strikes, but low enough to sprawl against takedown attempts. His feet would maintain just enough distance to avoid grappling range, but close enough to launch his own attacks. He would move with the fluid grace of a dancer and the predatory focus of a hunting cat, always ready to explode into action or defend against an incoming assault. When the fight moved to the ground, and eventually almost all Pankration matches did, the true artistry of the sport revealed itself. Here, in the intimate space of grappling range, technique reigned supreme over raw strength. A smaller, more skilled fighter could use leverage and timing to overcome a larger opponent, applying joint locks and chokes with the precision of a master craftsman. The submission techniques of Pankration were sophisticated beyond anything found in contemporary martial arts. Pancratius developed arm bars that could hyperextend the elbow joint to the point of dislocation, leg locks that could snap bones like twigs, and chokes that could render an opponent unconscious in seconds. They understood the human body's vulnerabilities with anatomical precision, knowing exactly how much pressure needed to be applied to which points to force a submission. But perhaps even more impressive than their technical knowledge was their ability to remain calm and analytical under extreme duress. A Pancratiust might find himself trapped in a seemingly hopeless position, perhaps caught in a choke hold that was gradually cutting off his air supply, and yet he would continue to work methodically for an escape, his mind clear and focused, even as his body screamed for oxygen. The psychological aspect of Pankration was every bit as important as the physical. Competitors would attempt to break their opponent's will through intimidation and pain, but they had to be careful not to lose control of their own emotions in the process. Anger could lead to reckless attacks that left one vulnerable to counters. Fear could cause hesitation at crucial moments. Pride could prevent a fighter from submitting when further resistance would only lead to serious injury. The most successful Pancratius were those who could maintain perfect emotional equilibrium throughout the chaos of combat. They would inflict tremendous punishment on their opponents while remaining almost serene in their demeanor, like surgeons performing a particularly complex operation. They understood that Pankration was as much a mental game as a physical one, and they played that game with the strategic depth of chess masters. Some matches would end quickly, in the explosive flurry of a perfectly timed combination or the sudden snap of a submission hold, applied with surgical precision. Others would stretch on for what seemed like hours. Two equally matched opponents locked in a grueling test of endurance and will. The crowd would watch in fascination as these human dramas unfolded, witnessing displays of courage and skill that would be remembered and recounted for generations. The rules of submission were simple. A competitor could signal defeat by raising his hand or tapping his opponent or the ground. Once this signal was given, the contest would end immediately. There was no shame in submission. Indeed, the Greeks viewed it as a sign of wisdom to recognize when further resistance would only lead to permanent injury. A fighter who continued to struggle when caught in an inescapable hold was considered foolish rather than brave. But despite this safety mechanism, Pankration remained an incredibly dangerous sport. Competitors regularly suffered broken bones, torn ligaments, and severe concussions. Some would lose consciousness from chokes and take several minutes to revive. Others would suffer injuries that would end their athletic careers permanently. And occasionally, though the ancient sources are frustratingly vague about specifics, competitors would die. The most famous death in Olympic pankration occurred in 564 BCE, during the competition between Aricion of Phigalia and an unnamed opponent. According to the ancient historian Pausanias, Aricion found himself caught in a chokehold that was slowly draining the life from his body. Unable to break free, he summoned his remaining strength for one final desperate technique, a toe hold that caused his opponent such excruciating pain that the man immediately submitted. But the submission came too late. Even as his opponent was tapping in defeat, Aricion was dying from the effects of strangulation. When the officials rushed to check on the competitors, they found Aricion's body lifeless, his face still locked in the grimace of his final effort. His opponent, though technically defeated, would walk away from the competition. Aricion would be carried from the scama as the Olympic champion, crowned with victory in death. The judges ruled that since Aricion's opponent had submitted before Aricion had actually died, the victory belonged to the dead man. It was a decision that perfectly captured the Greek understanding of heroism, the belief that the truest victories were those won at the ultimate cost, that glory achieved through death was somehow purer and more noble than glory achieved through mere survival. Stories like this did not discourage participation in pankration. If anything, they enhanced its appeal. The Greek concept of kleos, immortal glory achieved through great deeds, meant that a beautiful death in athletic competition was preferable to a long life of mediocrity. Better to die as Aricion did, his name remembered for millennia, than to live as a forgotten old man who had never tested himself against the ultimate challenges. This attitude might seem incomprehensible to modern sensibilities, but it reflected a fundamentally different understanding of what human life was for. The Greeks believed that the purpose of existence was not comfort or longevity, but the cultivation of excellence in all its forms. They would rather burn brightly for a brief time than smolder dimly for decades. They would rather risk everything in pursuit of arete than play it safe and achieve nothing memorable. The champions who emerged from this crucible became figures of almost mythical significance in Greek culture. Their names were recorded in victor lists that were maintained for centuries. Statues were erected in their honor, not just at Olympia, but in their home cities as well. Poets would compose odes celebrating their achievements, and these poems would be performed at symposiums and festivals throughout the Greek world. Perhaps the most celebrated pancratiast in history was Theogenes of Thasos, who competed in the 5th century BCE. According to ancient sources, Theogenes won the Pankration competition at the Olympic Games twice and also claimed victory in boxing. But his Olympic triumphs were just a small part of his overall record. He supposedly won over 1,300 competitions during his career, a number so staggering that it approaches the realm of legend. Theogenes was said to possess not just exceptional athletic ability, but an almost supernatural understanding of combat. Opponents would describe feeling as though they were fighting not just a man, but some force of nature given human form. His techniques were reportedly so refined that he could defeat skilled fighters without seeming to exert any effort at all. He would move with the fluid grace of water flowing around obstacles, always finding the path of least resistance to victory. But Theogenes' greatness lay not just in his technical mastery, but in his approach to competition itself. He was known for his generosity toward defeated opponents, helping them to their feet after matches and often providing financial assistance to those who had suffered injuries. He understood that his victories were made meaningful only by the quality of his opposition, and he treated his fellow competitors with the respect due to fellow warriors. When Theogenes finally died, his legend only grew. According to Pausanias, a statue erected in his honor on the island of Thasos became the object of veneration. People would make pilgrimages to touch the bronze figure, believing that it retained some of the champion's power. One man, harboring a grudge against the deceased athlete, would come to whip the statue each night, until one evening it toppled and crushed him to death. The statue was subsequently tried for murder and thrown into the sea, as was the custom for objects that had caused human death. But soon after, the island was struck by crop failures and famine. The oracle at Delphi, when consulted, declared that the troubles would continue until all exiles were recalled to the island. The Thasians interpreted this to include the statue of Theogenes, which was recovered from the ocean floor and restored to its place of honor. Immediately, the famine ended, and the island returned to prosperity. Such stories illustrate the profound impact that great pancratiasts had on Greek consciousness. They were seen not just as athletes, but as heroes whose achievements transcended the merely physical and entered the realm of the sacred. Their victories in the Scammer were viewed as proof that human beings, through dedication and courage, could momentarily bridge the gap between mortal and divine. The training methods that produced such champions were themselves worthy of legend. Young athletes would begin their preparation not with combat techniques, but with the development of what the Greeks called paideia, a comprehensive education that encompassed physical, intellectual, and moral development. They would study geometry and music alongside wrestling and boxing, understanding that true excellence required harmony between mind and body. The physical preparation was methodical and progressive. Beginning athletes would spend months developing basic fitness through running, swimming, and gymnastics. They would lift heavy stones to build strength, sprint up hillsides to develop explosive power, and practice yoga-like flexibility exercises to maintain joint mobility. Only after establishing this foundation would they begin learning actual combat techniques. The technical curriculum was vast and sophisticated. Students would learn dozens of different throws, each with its own subtle variations and applications. They would drill submissions until they could apply them blindfolded, developing the muscle memory that would allow them to react instantly in competition. They would spar countless hours, gradually increasing the intensity until they could function effectively under the stress of real combat. But perhaps most importantly, they would learn to cultivate the mental state necessary for pankration success. This involved meditation practices designed to develop concentration and emotional control, breathing exercises that could help maintain calm under pressure, and visualization techniques that allowed athletes to mentally rehearse their performances before competition. The dietary regimens followed by pankratiasts were also carefully structured. They would eat primarily meat and fish to build muscle mass, supplemented by nuts and oils for energy. They would avoid alcohol and rich foods that might slow their reflexes or add unnecessary weight. Some would experiment with fasting to improve their pain tolerance and mental clarity. Sleep and recovery were treated with religious reverence. Athletes would maintain strict schedules, going to bed at sunset and rising before dawn. They would use massage and hot baths to aid muscle recovery, and would often retreat to temples or sacred groves for periods of contemplation and spiritual preparation. The gymnasiums where this training took place were marvels of ancient engineering and architecture. The most famous was the Academy in Athens, founded by Plato, which combined physical training with philosophical education. Here, beneath colonnades decorated with frescoes depicting mythical athletic contests, the finest minds and bodies of the Greek world would gather to push the boundaries of human potential. The daily routine in such establishments followed patterns that had been refined over centuries. Training would begin before sunrise, with light exercises designed to warm the body and focus the mind. This would be followed by technical instruction, with masters demonstrating techniques while students practiced on wooden dummies or with training partners. The afternoon would be devoted to intensive sparring, with competitors testing their skills against opponents of varying styles and abilities. The masters would circulate among the pairs, offering corrections and advice, occasionally demonstrating techniques themselves with a fluidity and power that reminded everyone why they had achieved their reputations. Evenings would be spent in discussion and analysis. Students would sit in circles around their teachers, describing the challenges they had faced during the day's training and receiving guidance on how to overcome them. They would analyze the techniques of famous champions, breaking down complex movements into their component parts and discussing the strategic principles that made them effective. This combination of physical and intellectual training produced athletes who were not just skilled fighters, but thoughtful strategists capable of adapting their approaches to any opponent or situation. They understood pankration not just as a collection of techniques, but as a complete system of human movement and psychology. The philosophical dimensions of pankration training were particularly important. Students were taught to view their practice not just as preparation for competition, but as a form of spiritual discipline. Each training session was an opportunity to confront their limitations and transcend them, to discover aspects of themselves that remained hidden in ordinary life. They learned to embrace pain as a teacher rather than an enemy, understanding that discomfort was often a sign that growth was occurring. They would deliberately place themselves in challenging situations, perhaps practicing techniques while exhausted, or sparring against larger, stronger opponents, not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they knew that championship-level performance required the ability to function effectively under adverse conditions. The concept of sophrosine, self-control or moderation, was central to their development. Pankratiasts learned to apply just enough force to achieve their objectives, no more and no less. They understood that excessive aggression could be as counterproductive as insufficient intensity, and they cultivated the judgment necessary to calibrate their responses precisely. This psychological sophistication extended to their understanding of competition itself. Great Pankration were students of human nature, as much as they were masters of technique. They would study their opponent's habits and preferences, looking for patterns that could be exploited. They would develop game plans tailored to specific matchups, preparing multiple strategies in case their primary approach proved ineffective. During actual competition, they would remain constantly alert to their opponent's emotional states, watching for signs of frustration or fatigue that might create opportunities for attack. They would vary their own tactics to keep opponents guessing, sometimes fighting aggressively from the start, other times remaining defensive until the perfect moment for a decisive counterattack. The mental game extended beyond the competition itself to the broader context of athletic achievement. Successful Pankration learned to manage the pressure that came with high-stakes competition, the weight of expectations from their home cities, and the knowledge that their performance would be remembered and discussed for years to come. They would use visualization techniques to mentally rehearse not just successful performances, but also how they would respond to setbacks and challenges. They understood that no competition would unfold exactly according to plan, and they prepared themselves to adapt and improvise when circumstances required it. The support systems surrounding elite Pankration were sophisticated by ancient standards. Wealthy patrons would sponsor promising athletes, providing financial support that allowed them to train full-time without worrying about earning a living. These relationships were considered mutually beneficial. The patron gained prestige from association with a successful athlete, while the athlete gained the resources necessary to achieve his potential. The most successful athletes would also attract teams of specialists to support their development. These might include massage therapists, who understood the specific muscular demands of pankration, physicians who could treat the injuries that were inevitable in such a violent sport, and tactical advisors who could analyze opponents and develop strategic approaches for specific matchups. Some Pankration would travel extensively during their careers, competing in games throughout the Greek world and learning techniques from masters in different regions. This cross-pollination of ideas and methods contributed to the continuous evolution of the sport, with new techniques and strategies being developed and refined constantly. The most dedicated athletes would also seek out the most challenging training partners they could find, understanding that improvement required constantly pushing beyond their comfort zones. They would spar with wrestlers to improve their ground game, box with pugilists to sharpen their striking, and even train with soldiers to understand how their skills might translate to actual combat situations. As Pankration evolved over the centuries, distinct regional styles began to emerge. Athletes from Sparta were known for their incredible toughness and conditioning, reflecting the military culture of their city-state. They would train in harsh conditions, deliberately exposing themselves to extremes of heat and cold, hunger and thirst, believing that such hardships would make them unbreakable in competition. Athenian Pankratists, by contrast, were renowned for their technical sophistication and strategic thinking. They approached the sport with the same intellectual rigor that their city brought to philosophy and mathematics, developing complex systems of techniques and tactics that could be adapted to any situation. Athletes from the islands and coastal regions often specialized in techniques that took advantage of superior flexibility and agility, perhaps reflecting the influence of maritime culture, where balance and adaptability were essential survival skills. They would develop flowing, dance-like fighting styles that emphasized movement and positioning over raw strength. The mountain peoples of Greece produced Pankratists, known for their incredible endurance and pain tolerance. Training at high altitude and in rugged terrain, they would develop cardiovascular systems and muscular strength that allowed them to maintain peak performance even in the longest and most grueling competitions. These regional variations added richness and depth to Pankration competition, as athletes with different stylistic approaches would meet and test their methods against each other. The most successful competitors were those who could adapt their own styles to counter the specific strengths of their opponents, while exploiting any weaknesses in their approaches. The judging of Pankration competitions was handled by the Hellenodikes, officials whose authority was considered sacred and whose decisions were final. These men were selected for their knowledge of the sport and their unquestionable integrity, as any suspicion of corruption would undermine the religious significance of the games. The judges would position themselves around the scammer, where they could observe the action from multiple angles, watching for illegal techniques and determining when submissions had occurred. They carried rabdoi, long, flexible rods, that they would use to separate competitors if necessary, or to strike anyone who attempted a forbidden technique. The application of the rules required considerable expertise, as Pankration techniques could happen very quickly, and judges needed to distinguish between legal and illegal actions in real time. A strike that appeared to be aimed at the body might graze the face, potentially constituting an illegal blow to the head. A joint lock that was properly applied might be confused with an attempt to break fingers, which was forbidden. The judges also had to determine when submissions had genuinely occurred versus when competitors were simply experiencing temporary disadvantage. A fighter caught in a painful hold might appear to be tapping out when he was actually just trying to improve his position. The Hellenodices had to develop the experience and judgment necessary to make these distinctions accurately under pressure. Beyond the technical aspects of officiating, the judges served an important ritual function. They represented the divine authority under which the games were conducted, and their presence sanctified the competitions. Before each contest, they would offer prayers to Zeus and other gods, asking for divine protection for the competitors and divine guidance in their own decision-making. The prizes awarded to Olympic victors were deliberately modest, simply crowns woven from wild olive branches. But the symbolic value of these simple wreaths was immense, representing achievement that transcended material wealth. Olympic champions would be treated as heroes for the rest of their lives, honored in their home cities with parades, feasts, and sometimes even exemption from taxes. The true reward for victory, however, was the immortal glory that came with Olympic achievement. Champions' names would be recorded in the official victor lists that were maintained at Olympia, ensuring that their accomplishments would be remembered long after their deaths. Poets would compose victory odes in their honor, and these poems would preserve not just their names, but detailed accounts of their achievements. Some Olympic Pankration champions would leverage their fame into careers as teachers or trainers, passing on their knowledge to new generations of athletes. Others would become military leaders, their reputations for courage and skill in hand-to-hand combat, making them natural choices for command positions. The most successful champions might even achieve a form of hero worship, with shrines built in their honor and regular festivals celebrating their achievements. Their stories would be told and retold, gradually acquiring mythical dimensions as the details were embellished over time. But for all its glory and cultural significance, Pankration remained a brutal and dangerous sport that exacted a tremendous physical toll on its practitioners. Chronic injuries were common among competitive athletes, and many would suffer permanent damage from their years of training and competition. Joint problems were particularly prevalent, as the submission holds used in Pankration placed enormous stress on knees, elbows, and shoulders. Fighters who competed for many years would often develop arthritis and reduced range of motion, that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Head injuries were another serious concern, though the ancient Greeks had no understanding of concepts like concussions or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Competitors who suffered repeated blows to the head might develop personality changes or cognitive problems that would be attributed to divine intervention or natural aging rather than athletic injury. Despite these risks, the sport continued to attract the finest athletes in the Greek world, drawn by the unique combination of physical challenge, cultural prestige, and spiritual significance that Pankration offered. The willingness of competitors to accept such risks in pursuit of excellence reflected the fundamental Greek belief that a life lived without greatness was not worth living. The techniques of Pankration were preserved and transmitted through master-student relationships that might span multiple generations. The most successful instructors would develop distinctive methodologies and training systems that would be jealously guarded and passed down only to their most trusted pupils. Some masters would establish schools that would operate for decades or even centuries, becoming centers of excellence that would attract students from across the Greek world. These institutions would develop their own traditions and customs, creating lineages of knowledge that would persist long after their founders had died. The technical content of Pankration training was incredibly sophisticated, encompassing hundreds of techniques and tactical concepts. Students would learn not just individual moves, but complete systems of attack and defense that could be adapted to countless different situations. The striking component drew heavily from boxing, but adapted the techniques for the mixed-range environment of Pankration. Fighters would learn to throw punches while remaining aware of takedown attempts, to use footwork that worked equally well for striking and wrestling, and to transition seamlessly between different ranges of combat. The grappling aspect was even more complex, incorporating elements from wrestling, but expanding far beyond what was allowed in pure wrestling competition. Pankratius would learn to use their legs for attacks and defense in ways that wrestlers never could, developing guard positions and submission attempts that would seem remarkably modern to contemporary martial artists. The ground fighting system of Pankration was particularly advanced, with techniques for controlling position, escaping from disadvantageous situations, and applying a wide variety of submission holds. Students would spend years learning the subtle details of leverage and anatomy that made these techniques effective, understanding exactly how to position their bodies to maximize their mechanical advantage. But technical knowledge alone was not sufficient for Pankration success. The mental aspects of the sport were equally important, and masters would spend considerable time developing their students' psychological capabilities. They would teach meditation techniques to improve concentration, breathing exercises to maintain calm under stress, and visualization methods to prepare for competition. The concept of flow state, what the Greeks might have called divine possession, was central to Pankration performance. The greatest athletes would describe moments of perfect clarity and effortless action, when their techniques would emerge without conscious thought, and their responses to opponents' attacks would be instantaneous and perfect. Achieving this state required years of preparation and the development of what modern psychologists might call unconscious competence. The ability to perform complex skills without conscious attention. Pankratists would drill their techniques until they became automatic, until their bodies could respond correctly, even when their minds were occupied with higher-level strategic thinking. The training methods used to develop this automaticity were both physical and mental. Students would practice techniques while blindfolded, forcing them to rely on kinesthetic awareness rather than visual input. They would spar while exhausted, learning to execute precise movements even when their bodies were screaming for rest. They would also engage in various forms of mental training, perhaps meditating while holding difficult physical positions, or practicing techniques while reciting poetry or solving mathematical problems. The goal was to develop the ability to function effectively on multiple levels simultaneously, to maintain technical precision, while also processing strategic information and managing emotional responses. The most advanced practitioners would eventually transcend the need for specific techniques altogether, developing an intuitive understanding of combat that allowed them to respond appropriately to any situation. They would move with the spontaneous creativity of master artists, each moment of combat becoming an opportunity for improvisation and expression. This highest level of Pankration mastery was rare and precious, achieved by only a handful of athletes in each generation. These masters would compete not just with their bodies, but with their entire beings, mind, body, and spirit united in perfect harmony toward a single purpose. When such a master entered the skama, the quality of the competition would change dramatically. Spectators who had witnessed thousands of athletic contests would sense that they were about to see something extraordinary, something that transcended the merely physical and approached the realm of art. The movements of a true Pankration master had a quality that was almost musical, each technique flowing naturally into the next without pause or hesitation. Their strikes would land with perfect timing and placement. Their throws would seem to use their opponent's own momentum against them, and their submissions would be applied with the inexorable precision of natural law. But perhaps most remarkably, these masters would compete with a serenity that seemed almost supernatural. No matter how violent the action became, no matter how much punishment they absorbed or inflicted, they would maintain an inner calm that was visible in their expressions and body language. They had learned to separate their essential selves from the physical experience of combat, to remain centered and aware even in the midst of chaos. The careers of such masters would become the stuff of legend, their most spectacular victories remembered and recounted for generations. Stories would be told of impossible comebacks, of techniques so perfectly executed that they seemed to bend the laws of physics, of moments when human potential seemed to touch the divine. One such legend concerned Dioxippus of Athens, who competed in the 4th century BCE and was considered by many to be the greatest pancratiast who ever lived. According to the ancient sources, Dioxippus possessed not just exceptional technical skill, but an almost mystical ability to anticipate his opponent's actions before they themselves were fully aware of their intentions. The story goes that during one Olympic competition, Dioxippus faced an opponent who was renowned for his size and strength, a man who had never been taken down, let alone submitted, in his entire career. The crowd expected a long, grueling battle between these two titans of the sport. Instead, Dioxippus ended the contest in less than a minute. As his opponent charged forward with a powerful combination of strikes, Dioxippus seemed to simply fade away from the attack, his body moving with liquid grace around the incoming blows. Then, in a motion so quick that many spectators missed it entirely, he applied a throwing technique that used his opponent's own momentum to send him crashing to the sand. Before the larger man could recover, Dioxippus had secured a chokehold that was applied with such precision that resistance was impossible. The submission came almost instantly, leaving the crowd in stunned silence at what they had just witnessed. But it was not just the speed of the victory that amazed those present. It was the quality of movement, the perfect economy of motion, the sense that every action had been inevitable and necessary. Dioxippus had not simply defeated his opponent. he had demonstrated a level of mastery that seemed to belong to a different category of human experience altogether. Such performances were rare and precious, but they served an important function in Greek culture. They provided proof that human beings could, through dedication and discipline, transcend their ordinary limitations and achieve something approaching perfection. They offered glimpses of what arete truly meant, not just competence or skill, but excellence so pure that it bordered on the divine. The influence of Pankration extended far beyond the boundaries of athletic competition. The techniques and training methods developed for the sport were quickly adopted by Greek military forces, who recognized their value in hand-to-hand combat situations. Soldiers would train in Pankration-derived techniques to prepare for situations where they might be disarmed or forced to fight at close quarters. The Spartan army in particular made extensive use of Pankration training, incorporating it into the agoge, the rigorous educational system that produced the most feared warriors in the Greek world. Young Spartan men would spend years developing Pankration skills alongside traditional military training, understanding that the mental toughness and physical conditioning required for the sport would serve them well in actual warfare. The psychological benefits of Pankration training were considered as valuable as the physical techniques. Soldiers who had experienced the intensity of full contact competition were less likely to panic under the stress of battle, more confident in their to handle physical confrontation, and better able to think clearly under pressure. Alexander the Great reportedly employed Pankratias as bodyguards and special forces, valuing their unique combination of combat skills and mental toughness. These men would accompany the Macedonian army on its conquests, serving as elite troops who could be relied upon in the most dangerous and demanding situations. The spread of Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean and beyond carried Pankration with it, and the sport was practiced wherever Greek influence extended. Local variations developed as the techniques were adapted to different cultural contexts and combined with indigenous fighting methods, creating a diverse family of martial arts that all traced their lineage back to the original Greek system. In Egypt, Pankration blended with local wrestling traditions to create hybrid forms that emphasize ground fighting and submission techniques. In Asia Minor, the influence of Persian and other Middle Eastern fighting methods added new striking techniques and tactical approaches. In Sicily and southern Italy, the sport evolved in response to the unique conditions of Greek colonial life. But even as Pankration spread and evolved, its spiritual and philosophical dimensions remained central to its practice. Wherever the sport was practiced seriously, it retained its character as a means of personal development and self-discovery, a way for human beings to explore the outer limits of their potential. The decline of Pankration began with the rise of Roman power in the Mediterranean world. The Romans, while they appreciated Greek culture in many ways, had a fundamentally different approach to athletic competition. Where the Greeks saw sport as a form of religious worship and personal development, the Romans viewed it primarily as entertainment for the masses. The Roman adoption of Greek athletic traditions resulted in significant changes to both the rules and the cultural context of competition. Pankration contests in Roman amphitheatres became more focused on spectacular violence and less concerned with technical excellence or spiritual development. The subtle artistry that had characterized the Greek approach was gradually lost as the sport was transformed into a more sensationalized spectacle. The rise of Christianity in the late Roman Empire dealt another blow to Pankration, as the new religion viewed the Greek emphasis on physical perfection and competition as contrary to Christian values of humility and spiritual focus. The Olympic Games, which had survived for over 1,000 years, were finally abolished in 393 CE by the Christian Emperor Theodosius I. With the end of the Olympics, Pankration lost its most important cultural platform and began a long decline that would eventually lead to its virtual disappearance from the historical record. The knowledge and techniques that had been developed over centuries were gradually forgotten as the social structures that had supported their transmission crumbled. But the influence of Pankration did not disappear entirely. Elements of the ancient art survived in various forms throughout the Byzantine Empire and beyond, carried forward by martial traditions that maintained some connection to the original Greek system. Medieval manuscripts contain references to fighting techniques that bear clear resemblances to Pankration methods, suggesting that some knowledge persisted even after the formal sport had ended. In the modern era, there has been a renewed interest in reconstructing ancient Pankration based on historical sources and archaeological evidence. Contemporary martial artists and historians have worked to piece together the techniques and training methods of the original art, creating modern versions that attempt to capture the essence of the ancient system. These reconstruction efforts have been aided by the discovery of new archaeological evidence, including frescoes and sculptures that depict Pankration techniques in detail. Modern athletes have also contributed by testing ancient techniques against contemporary martial arts, helping to determine which methods would have been most effective in their historical context. The modern mixed martial arts movement has also drawn inspiration from Pankration, recognizing it as perhaps the first systematic attempt to create a comprehensive fighting art that combines striking and grappling techniques. Many contemporary MMA practitioners study historical Pankration as a way of understanding the theoretical foundations of their own sport. But beyond its technical contributions, Pankation's greatest legacy may lie in its demonstration of what human beings can achieve when they commit themselves completely to the pursuit of excellence. The ancient Pankration showed that through discipline, courage, and dedication, ordinary people could transcend their limitations and achieve something extraordinary. Their willingness to risk everything in pursuit of arete offers a powerful example for anyone seeking to push beyond the boundaries of what seems possible. They understood that true growth requires stepping outside one's comfort zone, that mastery demands the willingness to fail repeatedly in the process of learning, and that the greatest achievements often come at the greatest cost. The philosophical dimensions of Pankration training, the emphasis on self-knowledge, emotional control, and the integration of mind and body remain relevant to anyone seeking personal development in any field. The ancient masters understood that technique alone was never enough, that true mastery required the cultivation of wisdom, patience, and inner strength. Perhaps most importantly, Pankration embodied a holistic approach to human development that modern society has largely forgotten. The ancient Greeks did not separate physical training from intellectual development or spiritual growth. They understood that these aspects of human nature were interconnected and that true excellence required attention to all dimensions of human potential. In our current age of specialization, where athletes focus on narrow skill sets and scholars ignore their physical development, the Pankration model offers a reminder of what integrated human excellence might look like. It suggests that the highest achievements come not from maximizing one capability at the expense of others, but from developing all aspects of human potential in harmony with each other. The courage displayed by ancient Pankration also speaks to something essential about the human condition. In a world where we are increasingly insulated from risk and discomfort, their willingness to face pain and potential death in pursuit of their goals offers a stark reminder of what previous generations understood about the relationship between courage and meaning. They recognized that a life lived in safety might be comfortable, but it was unlikely to be memorable or significant. They chose instead to embrace risk and uncertainty, understanding that the possibility of great failure was the price that had to be paid for the possibility of great achievement. Standing here at the end of our journey through the history of Pankration, we find ourselves confronting the same fundamental questions that faced those ancient athletes as they prepared to enter the Scammer. What are we willing to risk in pursuit of excellence? How much discomfort are we prepared to endure in the process of growth? What does it mean to live a life of significance rather than mere survival? The sand of the ancient Olympic competition grounds has long since blown away, scattered by winds that have carried the dust of empires across the Mediterranean basin. The statues of great champions have crumbled, their names carved in stone worn smooth by centuries of weather. The gymnasiums where warriors trained their bodies and souls have fallen into ruin, their colonnades now home to weeds and wild animals. But something of their spirit persists, carried forward by every person who chooses the difficult path over the easy one, who risks failure in pursuit of something meaningful, who understands that the greatest victories are won not over external opponents, but over the limitations we impose upon ourselves. In the end, Pankration was never really about fighting at all. It was about the eternal human quest to discover what lies beyond the boundaries of what we think is possible, to push past the comfortable limits of ordinary existence and glimpse something extraordinary. It was about the transformation that occurs when we commit ourselves completely to a worthy challenge, when we refuse to accept good enough as sufficient, when we demand of ourselves nothing less than our absolute best. The athletes who stepped into that circle of sand so many centuries ago were not just competing for olive wreaths or temporary glory. They were participating in one of humanity's oldest and most important rituals, the testing of human potential against its ultimate limits. They were asking the fundamental questions that every generation must ask anew. How far can we go? How much can we endure? What might we become if we refuse to accept the boundaries that others have set for us? And in their willingness to risk everything in search of those answers, they left us a legacy that extends far beyond the technical details of ancient combat sports. They showed us what it looks like to live without reservation, to hold nothing back in pursuit of excellence, to embrace the full catastrophe of human existence with courage and grace. The sun that witnessed their struggles continues to rise each morning, casting the same golden light that once illuminated their contests across landscapes that have changed beyond recognition. But the essential drama they enacted, the eternal human story of limitation confronted and transcended, remains as relevant today as it was 25 centuries ago. We may no longer compete in Pankration, but we all face our own Scammer, our own moment of truth, where we must choose between safety and significance, between comfort and growth, between the person we are and the person we might become. And in that choice, in that moment of decision, we carry forward the true spirit of those ancient warriors who understood that the greatest victory is not over another human being, but over the voice within ourselves that whispers that we are not strong enough, not brave enough, not worthy enough to achieve something extraordinary. The history of Pankration is ultimately the history of human potential itself. Not just what we are, but what we might become if we have the courage to find out. And that story, that eternal quest for excellence and meaning and transcendence, continues to unfold with each new day, with each new choice to step forward into the unknown, rather than retreat into the familiar. The circle is never really complete. The contest never truly ends. And somewhere, in the part of us that remembers what it means to be fully alive, the spirit of those ancient champions continues to whisper, "What are you waiting for? The Skama is ready. Your time is now."